Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming, and it is a great pleasure of mine to launch this year's international lecture series at the Bartlett School of Architecture. And it is really exciting. I think we are very privileged this year because we have an enviable list of speakers coming from the very cutting edge of acute architectural research and practice from all over the world. And today this evening we are starting with a fantastic lecture of Adrian Lahoud, who is a good friend of mine and also someone who really inspires my work, but the work of many others in terms of urban research, one of the rare really vital and fresh urban research projects that we see at the moment. And Adrian is a director of Master of Advanced Architectural Program in Urban Design at the UTS Sydney. And his PhD, The Life of Forms in the City, explores the problem of scale and complexity in architecture and the city. And he's also a regular contributor to both academic and mainstream publications, such as Thomas, for instance, in the Architectural Area. In 2010, he co-edited a very interesting issue of architectural design titled Post-Traumatic Urbanism, with names such as Slavoj Žižek in it. One of his recent exhibitions is a biennale in Korea that is curated by Ai Weiwei. It is a great pleasure to see Adrian here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alyssa, and to everyone at UCL for getting me over here. It's a great honor to be in the Darwin Auditorium. No pressure. Okay. So let's turn these lights off. Okay, so the title of tonight's talk is Post-Traumatic Urbanism. It's a term I use to describe a set of research interests that have as their common characteristic a sense that conflict is at the very basis of how the city is made. Post-traumatic urbanism then marks a certain proximity in my work to situations in which breaks, conflicts, fractures, and interruptions affect the city. So this prevailing sense that the city is subject to contingent events that threaten its viability is not recent. What is recent, however, is the intensification of populations in urban centres and the entanglement of networks that link those centres up. And I think this is causing a reformulation of the way we conceive of the city. And we can already see that in the last 5 years, a number of new practice and research models have evolved. An example is the new Anticipatory Spatial Practices degree at Harvard, which starts next year. And I want to show you the outline for this degree because I think it makes interesting reading. It says the program in Anticipatory Spatial Practices addresses a central fact of a volatile new reality. Unpredictable, large-scale shocks to the built and natural environment are inevitable. And then towards the end, it says at the heart of the program is a recognition that standard approaches to crisis in the form of short-term and post-hoc fixes no longer suffice, and that forward-looking anticipatory views are required if we are to build robust social, institutional, and ecological systems able to survive cataclysmic change. So I like this because it's a kind of preemptive urbanism. It's something like the Bush doctrine for designers in this age of so-called urban volatility. The challenge that programs like these attempt to address is how to formulate a coherent and systematic platform for long-term research on the city that basically acknowledges its contingent nature. So the research I want to show you today begins by taking specific sites of knowledge within the city and asking how we can use these sites to produce forms of knowledge that are generic and repeatable. And the research is organized into 4 modes of practice: urban research, doctoral research, it's number 2, 3, private practice, and 4, curatorial work. So the first 3 of these are understood as ways to develop, abstract, and test speculative knowledge about the city and architecture. And the fourth is really about the cultural structures that can begin to support these modes of inquiry. So the work traces a trajectory that begins with the city, moves into doctoral research, which reflects on this work and tries to draw some generalizable conclusions from it, in order to then redeploy this knowledge within the discipline in practice. So the projects I will show are first attempts to work through the implications of these interests, with the role of the doctoral research acting as a kind of bridge between them. And I should point out that the work is not a humanitarian project in the sense that perhaps the Harvard program tries to describe. I think architecture is probably more complicit with these problems and can't so easily extricate itself from this involvement. So I'll begin with a brief outline of some of this research. Tonight I want to focus on the ways in which the research is actually impacting design practice. So we're going to start off with trauma in a way, but we'll end with something quite different. Okay, so starting with a small idea of some of the urban research that we've been doing in Beirut. So my interest in Beirut comes out of, I guess, a formative experience I had in 1988, being in the city. My background is Lebanese, but also being in the city during the war, and as a kind of encounter with the Green Line and this sense that somehow there was this discontinuity which weaved its way through the city, and that actually half of the city was inaccessible. It was kind of this blind spot. And I think reflecting on all this work now, I think that experience in some way is informing a lot of the work I'm going to show you tonight. Beirut is also an exemplary case of a crisis in which the idea of a centralized plan, or for that matter, any plan, no longer exists. The city evolves through a series of local contingent decisions that just accumulate and structure growth. The anonymous materiality of the city fills the vacuum left behind by absent control structures. And one of the things I was interested in was the impact of these highly volatile conditions on the urban fabric. How did the continual interruption of communication, commerce, and movement in the city begin to transform the city? What adaptations evolved in response to these conditions of extreme stress? Okay, so one of the main effects of war is to produce a kind of sorting mechanism on the social body. Different social groups somehow like unbind from the collective and reform into groups oriented around specific identities. And then these groups then rebind with specific territories within the city. Right? And this scalar fracturing is also mirrored in a kind of temporal discontinuity. So as the conflict mutates, new actors emerge, old actors switch sides, the arena of conflict becomes unstable, and new disputes can arise in a constantly shifting series of locations. During any conflict, the supportive infrastructure of the city becomes uncertain and undependable. Each day you need to invent a new way to get to work, take children to school, buy food. Each moment is a continual negotiation, a series of trials and adaptations in which you try to build new paths around these interruptions. Right? So the slide that you can see here is a mapping of a social infrastructure in a district around the Beirut Central District in Beirut, 3 suburbs actually. This one here is Bashura, this one here is Mono, and the one at the top there is Jemezi. And what we've done is do a very, very simple path length analysis, which is to trace the distance between each block in that suburb and to trace the distance from there to all the social and commercial infrastructure you would need to access during a week. Right? And actually what we find is a kind of contraction, right? So the city moves from a kind of a support structure, right? Something that actually sustains life in these neighborhoods, to a threat structure, right? So the topology of the city begins to adapt. The network lengths literally contract and smaller, tighter clusters begin to form. And not only do you find a more fragmented and autonomous matrix of services, but also an increasing amount of redundancy and duplication in the provision of those services. And this idea of duplication or redundancy in the urban fabric as something that's actually produced by instability, I think is one of the interesting conclusions that you might be able to draw from this research. So you can sort of see this difference, huh? The neighborhood unit is shrinking. Now this semi-dysfunction, an environment of continual threat and anxiety continues to this day, manifesting in all sorts of improvised and makeshift security devices. And the more I think about this, the more I think that actually this dysfunction in Beirut is actually just another order of function, but perhaps one that is probably difficult to recognize at first because it seems so unstable if you're not accustomed to it. Okay, the Beirut Central District. So another dimension to this research was to examine the formation of the ring road which surrounds the Beirut Central District, which is this road through here. As the gleaming jewel in Beirut's private reconstruction effort, the Beirut Central District, or the BCD, excises the Burj, which is the traditional heart of the, or core civic space in the city, and reproduces it as a mechanism to extract petrodollars being spent by tourists from the Gulf. So in order to protect this investment space, the ring road encloses the CBD with two concentric lines of defense. And you can't really see the other one because it's not drawn on here, but it sits inside there. So an entire suite of makeshift security devices such as roadblocks, barricades, checkpoints, boom gates, strategically located at the intersections, allow the former city centre to be instantly, if temporarily, switched off. The infrastructure therefore operates in a number of different senses, as a conduit for the movement of people and goods, as an umbilical to the airport that allows visitors to almost teleport directly into the central district without realising they have passed through a refugee camp, but perhaps more interestingly as a military apparatus that can, when the need arises, decommission a part of the city. And here you can see a sort of mapping exercise that we did during a workshop, a field trip in Beirut, in which we methodically started to try to understand exactly what was happening at each of these control points. This is kind of a matrix drawing of those control points. And here you can see this here is the UN compound. This is the ring road cutting through there. This is the embassy compound on this side. And here you can see a series of blast walls. And this here is the choke point, right? So this just gets, there are a series of intersections like this around the BCD, and they just get turned off, right? And of course, the beautiful thing, because it's Beirut, is that that game can also be played by non-state actors as well. So this is May 2008, and this is the road to the airport. And this would be a whole nother story. Okay, so moving on. So the urban research I want to go through now, or I have been going through, is actually a 4-year project that's been ongoing. It's been titled Project for the Mediterranean. I, along with students and colleagues from UTS in Sydney, have been systematically researching various cities on the shore of the Mediterranean. This is the brief for this year and next year's project. So the first 3 years of work, we looked at the Middle East and North Africa. This year, in an attempt to reverse the colonial traffic in which information normally passes from the west to the east, we're trying to take what we've learned in the Middle East, looking at Beirut, looking at Tunis, looking at Tripoli, and see if we can somehow push it back into northern Italy. And actually, my students are in Trieste at this moment, so I've come over here literally for 24 hours. Another city that's experiencing instability of an entirely other order is Venice. Venice has evolved according to an entirely different dynamic than Beirut, and yet the island is an exemplary case study on the productive potential of discontinuity in the urban environment. So this year, students working with Sam Jacoby in the Projective Cities program at the AA examined the evolution of specific islands within Venice in terms of the interplay between the campo, the canal, the palazzo, and the church. Right? And these primary elements, through their form, organization, sequence of construction, establish a complex spatial framework whose evolution allows us to track transformations and reorientations in social, political, and commercial structures on the island. And in each case, the relative autonomy of the territorial parcel, parish, and family produces a kind of coherence at the scale of the part, but never the whole. Because the canal and the lagoon break the landmass into a series of discontinuous regions, a general absence of relation between the parts is produced, leading to an opportunistic connection wherever the possibility arises. Right? So I'll try and explain what I've just described. Right? So the original, can you see that? Yeah. So the original condition of Venice is, of course, a series of shallow marshes in a lagoon. Settlement proceeds through the location of a church and an adjoining field, which originally serves an agricultural purpose. Together they form the original centre of the island, with the church typically addressing the campo through here. And the campo also works. The campo, sorry, is just the square, right? You would call it a square. Originally it means field, right? But, and you can see here, so originally the dwellings face the church, but they're buffered from the church. Then, as we get towards the 1200s, residential expansion continues, but it's still around the periphery of the campo. As merchant activity then along the canal becomes more pronounced, right? Access to the water through the dwellings and to the canals becomes necessary. This has a number of effects. One is a typological mutation which gives the canal a sort of characteristic ground floor entrance. The third is the narrowing of sites that access the canal in order to increase the possibility of trade. So what I'm talking about here is the way that at a certain point an economic transformation on the island has shifted the orientation from, or the centre of gravity has gone from the church, right, to the periphery of the canal, because that's where all the money is happening, right? That's where all the trade is taking place. Anyway, the city stabilizes and basically from the 1700s on, there's not a whole lot of transformation in the city, right? So, the interesting thing about this research is that when we start to think about the way this very small sort of urban trajectory of evolution starts to have a kind of a global effect, right? So I'm trying to work out in my head through this research, actually, what are the kind of scales of transformation that are taking place? So we can see that if we overlay the marshes with the campi, we get this series of almost seed points, right, where development starts on each island. But then we also see that at the scale of the discrete entity of the island itself, it develops centrifugally out from a centralized pair of church and campo. It radiates out until a limit is established before folding back on itself, right? So this process creates a dense polynodal network when you view the island as a whole, right? But this larger order effect, and this is very important, is driven by a local demand, right? So the complexity of the island is only possible when each one of these discrete units operates with partial autonomy, right? So obeying similar laws of morphogenesis, but actualizing in different ways depending on the local circumstances. So this short piece of investigation reveals a productive interplay between the discrete nature of the individual island, growth that is both regulated and driven by a complex social, religious, and economic matrix, and the deployment and subsequent adaptation of ready-to-hand spatial types. What is interesting to my mind is the way a certain scale of the city, it's being fractured and discontinuous, prevents the possibility of coordination across the territory. The constellation of forces actualizes in different ways in each case, producing a consistent, highly porous and differentiated urban condition. So this research on the island was really, for us, just a way of familiarizing ourselves with the historical situation. The project that we're actually working on now is not located on the island, actually it's located on the mainland. Last Tuesday, we met with the municipality of Venice, who presented to us a territorial planning strategy, 3 years in the making, for which will be released to the public next week. They've invited us to begin research on 5 potential sites around the Porta Marghera area and Mestre, which is the mainland side of the island. And they've asked us to produce some ideas to try and help them work out what to do with these 5 sites. And this proposal comes at a really interesting time. Italy So I was going to say that the proposal comes at an interesting time because the euro crisis is placing the country under immense pressure. And this was some footage that was recorded last week in Venice. And it's very interesting. It actually shows a protest by a party that is protesting against an anti-immigration party, right? So you wouldn't call them a pro-immigration party, but you'd call them an anti-immigration party. So this is quite interesting. So literally, we literally just got off the plane and kind of, sorry? Oh, right, okay. I'll explain it in a moment. Yeah. Right, so what I was saying, sorry, was before the right footage. So I was saying that this proposal for us to, for invitation from the municipality in Venice to look at these 5 sites in Mestre and Porta Marghera on the mainland is arriving at a very sensitive moment for Italy as a whole. There's a kind of immense pressure at the moment, of kind of financial and social pressure. Okay, so the euro crisis is exacerbating a lot of these things. One of the things that it's really accelerating as well is this process of deindustrialization. So Porta Marghera is one of the most intense industrial areas in all of Italy. And of course, as the Italian economy transforms, this industrialization is kind of is dying off. It's kind of withdrawing from this territory. And like a lot of European countries, they're trying to work out what to do with these parts of the city. And the interesting thing about Porta Marghera is that it's had a very interesting or catalytic role, shall we say, in the Italian economy, because of course this was the birthplace of the workers' protests in the 70s and 80s, which were particularly violent. And it's actually interesting because the last time major plans were proposed, either for Trieste or for Venice, was exactly in the context of a kind of similar degree of social tension in the late 60s and early 70s. So this is Coroni's plan for Mestre, and this is Tamaro's plan for Trieste, which are both from the late 60s. Okay. Let's go back. So this work is current, and it will conclude probably in December this year. To reflect on both these bits of research, in both the case of Venice and Beirut, we find a complex interrelationship between urban processes that continually expand, contract, and subdivide as they encounter different forms of limits. The limit in this sense of spatial or temporal separation becomes a productive condition, right? So one that allows difference to be articulated through the constitution of distinct parts. And the shifts, reorientations, and transformations of these elements, their ability to enter into new compositions and to literally produce a new scale within their respective cities, occurs because of these productive discontinuities. The question that the work asks, therefore, is whether we must understand these specific sites as singularities, right, as exceptional cases, or whether it's possible to take certain generalities, right? Can we abstract information out of them, and can then we redeploy this information in other contexts? In other words, can we make these ideas operative in architecture? And should they or could they inform a design method? And I think I'm really at the very beginning of answering this question, but I see the doctoral research that I'm doing as a bridge, as some sort of connection between this historical analysis and projective design work. So I want to talk about that next. Okay, this will be the heaviest part of the lecture, so I've tried to keep it as short as possible. My doctoral research takes this material and asks whether a coherent position can be formulated around the idea of the discontinuity between parts and the idea of scale as a kind of problem. A project always emerges out of the conflict between the autonomous projective instincts of the discipline and the sometimes precise, sometimes very intangible determinations that architecture inherits from other non-disciplinary actors. The process of design mediates between these conflicting forces, which pose distinct and sometimes irreconcilable problems for the project. And this idea of posing a problem is what I want to describe as kind of scale. So for me, scale is neither a ratio or a measure. Instead, scale is the means through which spatial problems are posed. Scale is problematic in the sense that it has to do with the way questions are constructed, abstracted, organized into groups and solved. In architecture and in urbanism, scale is conventionally understood as both a ratio and measure, so that some proportional correlation exists between the dimension of two things, say between a building and a drawing or a building and a person. So you might then ask, okay, what is at stake in trying to produce a new sense for this word? And I think that there are two answers to this. And the first one has to do with the idea of complexity. So if the city is the object of architecture and is an object that is now synonymous with complexity, more importantly, the problem is posed such that this complexity is excessive. It's too much. So the discipline then is always caught in a position of informational deficit with regards to its object. It's trying to sort of catch it, but it can't. The city appears through a form of knowledge that continually recalibrates around its object, always trying to provide increasingly high resolution and live representations of it in order to control and close this deficit. In one sense, the issue is that complexity is neutralized as a concept and becomes recast as a mere excess of variables. Now, the concept of the city that emerges from these practices is highly interconnected and it's contingent, but it's a contingency that's primarily presented to us as a problem of environmental management and not of politics. So thinking back to the work I showed in both Beirut and Venice, you have a typical case of complex emergent behaviors. What I described as the anonymous materiality of the city. In the case of Beirut, the neighborhood unit begins to contract as path lengths minimize in order to avoid exposure to the threat presented by the city. In Venice, the constellation of spatial types transforms in both its address, location, and organization in response to the limit of the island and the shift in the center of gravity from the church to the canal. In each case, the city emerges out of an action that is coordinated within a strictly local horizon. Right? Now, to my mind, the mistake made in most homilies to sort of bottom-up emergent thinking is to somehow naturalize this tendency, right, to depoliticize it. And the central figure within this ethos is not Manuel de Landa, it's Jane Jacobs. And I think my disagreement with a kind of lineage in urban thinking is that while I think these anonymous tendencies are absolutely important to understand, it's why we study them, I don't think that our relationship to them needs to be one of fidelity, right? They condition our domain of action, but they do not exhaust it. Architecture and urban design are still matters of decision-making, that is to say politics. And a decision must reserve the right to refuse this reflexive inheritance of what already exists. And I locate this moment of refusal in the cut or in separation. So a significant portion of the doctoral research is to look to precedents in which the idea of the part-part relationship in architecture unbinds in some way. In each case, the idea of the whole is jeopardized or held in a kind of tension. And the projects, most of which are unbuilt, I'm not going to talk about Warren Weaver. The projects, most of which are unbuilt, and I'm sure you'll recognize them all, so I'm not going to describe them all, but we have, of course, Villa Adriana at Tivoli, the Dominican Mother House by Louis Kahn, which is really a sort of very brilliant essay on the relationship between a frame and the part. Oswald Matthias Unger's student housing program in Enschede. And of course, Piranesi's redrawing of the Campo Marzio, which actually we know Kahn famously had above his desk, right? So of course, the Dominican Mother House is also a reflection on the Campo Marzio. This drawing, which is this kind of talismanic drawing for many architects, which Tafuri variously referred to as an architectural banquet of nausea, a denunciation, a semantic void, a formless tangle, a homogeneous magnetic field, and unambiguous satire. And the point of doing these grid drawings, like these things, is to understand the way in which the part is conditioned by a problem, which establishes a strictly local coherence in the project. So rather than synthesize these parts into a unity, the projects in different ways suggest that difference can be suspended in what Rem Koolhaas very poetically described 30 years ago as a state of mere coexistence. So in the separation of the elements in both plan and in section, the projects produce a series of continuity errors, gaps, and conflicts whose recalcitrant geometries often remain untamed. And you can see this in the moments where the edges of the grid start to fray together. And in doing so, they stage a kind of paradoxical conflict between different registers of decision making. And this work it looks like it'll be published, or this set of drawings looks like it'll be published next year in a book, which is provisionally titled Spatial Organization in Architecture. But I think that's not so good. Okay, so the doctoral research, to sum up, is an attempt to take these specific pieces of urban research and ask how they might be activated within a discipline. And my way of doing this is to make an argument about scale and the relationship to the part, and to draw on a series of projects in which the idea of the part begins to unbind. And the purpose of this work is to start to produce some ideas and methods for the way I practice architecture. So next, I want to turn to some examples of design work that I've completed. Okay. So in order to understand the turbulence currently sweeping through the Middle East and North Africa, one should pay pilgrimage to a small, abandoned concrete structure located in the Lebanese city of Tripoli. Measuring 62 meters in diameter and almost hemispherical in shape, it sits in a dusty park in a once thriving city. From the outside, a perfectly curved shell is broken by 4 short black doorways. During the 5-minute period it typically takes for eyes to adjust to the light levels inside the dome, and before the visual features of the interior have taken shape, there is nothing but sound. This is a recording of us in the dome. You'll hear some of the students squeal with delight. Okay. You can kind of hear the joy of the people as they enter into the space and then realize they suddenly have this ability to produce this kind of, it was like walking into a musical instrument. And it's a very strange thing happened, of course, because we walked in, everyone was very quiet and solemn. And then as soon as they realized they could start throwing things around and making these huge echoing sounds, then suddenly the noise grew into this cacophony. And then the call to prayer took place. And so we heard from 2 separate minarets a kind of stereophonic recitation of the Quran come into the space, and everyone just went really, really quiet again. It was this kind of profound spatial experience. Okay. So in the acoustic signature of this space, all is misaligned. Rhythms crash into each other, time signatures multiply, and 5 times a day you can hear the call to prayer. Designed by Oscar Niemeyer, the dome is a small part of the most radical, if little known, urban projects envisaged for the Middle East. Measuring over 600,000 square meters, the Rashid Karami Fair and Exposition site was conceived as more than just an additional recreational or commercial space for the city. It was intended to present a new idea of the city based on the synthesis of work, life, and culture in an open civic landscape. Conceived in the late 50s, construction began in 62, but was interrupted by the Civil War in 75. And looking at Tripoli from the air, you have this extraordinary plan of an ellipse in the park, which resembles nothing less than a petri dish of prototypical architectural forms. This is the concert hall. This is the dome. So things like faceted cones, parabolic arches, and planes of concrete seemingly floating in this amniotic landscape. A diverse constellation of programs are contained in these forms, and the sense that the project constituted a type of urban laboratory is far from metaphorical. Though the park is now enclosed by a freeway, Niemeyer intended that these parts, particularly the proposed housing components, would almost grow and start to integrate the site into the surrounding city. At the moment, it's abandoned. There's kind of nothing happening to it. And there have been some typically very bad proposals, things like theme parks, etc. Right? So my project starts from here, and it says that, well, you can only really understand any large piece of public infrastructure is really only as successful as the supportive tissue it's installed within. So this project aims to save the site by revitalizing the periphery of the site. Right? So the upper contour of the massing limit is shaped by sight lines, which you can see here. And these sight lines carve out a form based on a kind of vision to the mountains. Right? 'Cause this is kind of surrounded here by these very high mountains. And this elliptical form creates an enclosed ring or limit around the park, re-establishing this dialogue with the mountain. So the structure takes an urban artifact, in this case a courtyard, and rescales it to the size of the park, creating an enclosed public room, which is the part in red, at the size of the city. By limiting the visual connection to the context, the building doubles the possible reading of the site, now understood as a courtyard surrounded by a ring of infrastructure, but also as a city bound by its own natural topography. And in this way, the starting point, this is just the starting point of the project, avoids kind of vandalizing the Niemeyer plan, right? Which is all about this very flat datum and this choreography of very particular forms. So the idea here is it's kind of like a heritage project, but actually you don't touch the building. You realize that the reason the site is not working is the environment, it's not so much the site itself. Okay, so you can see here as kind of sort of master plan. This is showing the sequence of these very clearly delimited development zones, this ring building which now encloses the project, a remediation of the canal which runs down to the water, some new transport infrastructure. I don't really want to go into the project at this scale very much because I really want to zoom in on a specific part of it. This is the view from inside the park. Okay, I just want to talk about this tower. So the problem this tower addresses is the difficult coexistence between traditional building fabric and high-density building types. So in many cities in the Middle East with little or no provision for heritage protection, the possibility of coexistence between different forms does not exist, right? Because there's actually no architectural vocabulary available, right? So there's nothing on hand that can accommodate it. On the other hand, in the retention of these sites, the result of this is a kind of tabula rasa approach to the context. On the other hand, in the mere retention of these sites and their conversion to photoprops made for the consumption of tourists, we face another problem, which is the reproduction of history as a kind of commodity. Right? And this would be the problem of the Beirut Central District. So if both of these problems, or these possibilities, are equally problematic, how do we begin to acknowledge that there is a real need for urban transformation? and yet retain the potential of coexisting, though different, regimes of city form. So the project addresses this through this idea of a flexible tripartite support structure that can transform to accommodate a series of small variable site conditions that would be characteristic of, let's say, the traditional core in an older city. So by joining the towers at the middle, two significant changes are introduced. Firstly, the public podium level occurs at the mid-rise of the tower, while the ground condition, which is now shaded, can take on a more active public character. And so the voids, poche, and I'll skip forward. So this is an image of, I should explain this. This is basically just a very simple exploded axonometric showing these different systems and the way they fit together. The plan is probably more interesting because in the plan you start to read these kind of gaps, right? And I think these gaps are really important. They allow for a kind of strategic autonomy to emerge between the different parts, right? By selectively delaminating these part-part relationships between the building and the context, between the facade and the floor plate, between the floor plate and the envelope, the functionality of each part becomes less dependent on that of its neighbours. It loses some connectivity, but it gains some room to move. And this is a collage looking from the city. And it's important to note that all these projects are understood by me as ways of exploring the design possibilities inherent in the research from before, right? So in a way, they're meant to test the application of my project, of my research. Okay, so next project. Oops, too soon. Heck, giving the game away, it's terrible, no? How are you going? Yeah, okay. Okay, so at a much larger spatial scale, but a shorter time scale, the next project is for a two-day entry for a competition organised by ThinkSpace in Zagreb, for which it received the third prize. The competition invited participants to rethink the idea of a geopolitical border. Now, the project has developed in part as a response to an announcement made by the French president, Nicolas Sarkozy, who proposed an economic and political union of all the states on the Mediterranean littoral. Right? And this would be along the lines of the EU, and he even went so far as to propose a kind of high-speed rail link that would loop around the shore, which is a mad idea, but we thought, okay, despite his agenda, maybe we can adapt it. So bearing in mind Sarkozy's geopolitical ambition and domestic exploitation of things like French xenophobia, the idea of a Mediterranean Union is nonetheless a startling one, and it could exceed this neoliberal birth. So the combined population of the littoral states is 500 million people, and despite the modern era of intense deadlock and impasse, the region has been a crucible not just of political discontent and conflict, but also generosity, intellect, and cultural exchange. And of course, Sarkozy's proposal takes place in the context of an EU policy that increasingly conceives of Southern Europe as a kind of fortress against refugees. And indeed, Sarkozy's agenda behind this proposal is really just one of securing European territorial integrity. Right? In the context of the Mediterranean and these sort of disparities between North and South, developed and underdeveloped, the optimistic scenario before us is, at best, the appearance of stronger economic growth, a stabilization of the birth rate, a development of a vibrant commercial and creative culture, better access to resources, a broader distribution of wealth, job creation, and the formation of a dynamic, cohesive civil society. The pessimistic scenario is something like economic stagnation, accelerated population growth, lack of job creation, concentration of wealth, social stress, and finally violence or even extremism. But there are signs of optimism. Though the past has been characterized by frustration, recent developments in North Africa and the Levant at least suggest signs of renewal. Europe, however, has recently experienced a series of fundamental challenges that are jeopardizing the very idea of a union. Ongoing financial crises, the loss of political legitimacy, shifts in social norms, difficult working conditions, and rising levels of immigration have resulted in widespread social tension, student protests, extremely unpopular austerity policies, and speculation even as to the amputation of so-called peripheral states from the Eurozone. And so it is in the context of this turmoil that this project takes place. And we began by trying to map a series of differentials across the entire Mediterranean, trying to understand the forces that are somehow driving its transformation, almost like a pressure system at the scale of the basin. So this graph shows, in a way, to me, these two images are the same. Huh? This graph shows the clear disparity between North Africa, Anatolia, the Levant, the Balkans, and Southern Europe with regards to things like political freedom, civil rights, energy consumption, exports, tourism, etc. Right? And you can see that actually once you break up the Mediterranean into a series of, once you break it up into the right scale, you have a very clear distinction between north and south. We also mapped a series of other things. This shows a series is based on Freedom House, which rates this kind of freedom of the press in different countries. Of course, a map of the historical unions or perhaps empires on the Mediterranean to show these kind of successive waves of colonization that have moved back and forth across the shore. Then a map of population and migration, and this is probably one of the most important ones. And without going into it too much, it's very obvious what the map tells you, which is that there's a massive pressure from the south to the north, and that pressure is focused at two specific points, which are the two most heavily policed water bodies in the world, which is the south of Spain and the area around Lampedusa, which is the Italian processing facility. I think that's what they call it. Okay, GDP from tourism. Now, there are two ways of reading this. A, that Spain, France, and Italy by far attract the most GDP from tourist flows. Another way of reading it is that actually then this is where all the future development of tourism will start to take place. This is critical. I think this is becoming increasingly critical. This is mapping the resources and energy usage consumption in across the Mediterranean. And the really fascinating thing about this is that as Europe, this battery's dying, as Europe starts to move towards a clean energy market, it's realizing that there's this incredible resource. And of course, Europe always eyes off Africa as a kind of resource in one way or another. And so suddenly we're having all these really ambitious pilot projects which are setting up huge solar arrays in Africa, right, as a way of working out how the European continent can kind of start to wean itself off fuels that are going to put more carbon in the atmosphere. Okay, I probably won't go through all of these. Okay. So, in light of this research, onto the proposal. Right? So this proposal, it's very important to say, is intended as a negative thesis, right? So, and by negative thesis, I mean that you take something to its conclusion, even if the conclusion is horrific, because you're trying to show something. And it's a reflection on the disparities between the northern and southern regions of the Mediterranean, but also on the impotence of architecture, which has been reduced to a shadow play of differences for their own sake. As in Koolhaas's City of the Captive Globe, to which it refers, the infinite urbanization of the city and the endless variability of architectural form it demands exhausts the possibility of difference as such. And the project is presented as a polemic text, so I'm just going to read it out, and it reads as follows. This project is about two lines, one existing and one proposed. The first line is invisible. It runs horizontally from east to west across the Mediterranean Sea. Like the contour lines in a weather forecast, it bends and twists according to the vast differentials of pressure between north and south. From the perspective of the African continent, Europe holds a minimal promise of opportunity that cannot be found at home. From the point of view of Europe, North Africa represents a local pool of labour power ready to be dipped into at will, a steady reserve of energy, increasingly solar, and kilometres of unspoilt coast ready for development. Like any bad relationship, this asymmetry is secured through structural violence. This violence must be flexible enough to accommodate the contradictions and dynamics of both parties. Changing domestic imperatives, economic demands, and legal requirements form plastic limits through which the stability of this line must be coordinated. The second line is impossible. It loops around and circles the first in order to intensify its contradictions. It groups together a series of Mediterranean cities in order to form a single corridor of mobility that encircles the sea. Passing through the centre, the line divides every city in two. And this leads to our first principle of contradiction. The line must cut in order to connect. Eventually, the line begins to thicken and expand, and a new transversal state is formed. The state is based on a principle of open citizenship and free passage. In each city, a gridded sampling of the local urban fabric will be transplanted into the space formed between these limits. Like a reflection in a broken mirror, each city will see its fractured gaze returned. At certain moments, strategic crossings of the new belt city will become possible. And this gives us our second principle of contradiction. The city plays host to its phantasmatic double. The city is hostage to its phantasmatic double. Disparities between different halves of the same city will become more extreme. Soon, different languages will be spoken. Smugglers will try to move between them, crawling through illegal tunnels. Cheap goods, construction workers, and capital will move in one direction. Tourists and aid agencies will move in the other. The extreme wealth of the Belt City will be a constant reminder of lack. Like Beirut's Green Line or the walls in Berlin and the West Bank, the differentials of pressure build and build until finally the situation becomes intolerable. This project is about two lines, one existing and one disputed. And so the work from the Mediterranean research that I've shown you, including some of the design research projects, is also, I think, coming out in a book next year, which has the provisional title of 34 Projects for the Mediterranean. So I like the kind of deadpan titles, as you can tell. The last design project I want to show you is an anonymous competition entry. So what I'm going to have to try to do is describe it and not give away where it is or what it's for. Because if it ends up in the public domain, then we could be disqualified. So I'm going to ask that no one takes any photos, please. Okay, and I've asked that the video doesn't go online till November. So the project's located on the Mediterranean in a part of the city that is still being made. And I'm going to quickly rush through the urban plan. It's a very simple concept for the building. It's literally two halls, or wings, I should say, that are surrounded by, enclosed by a colonnade. It has a warped roof. I'll just point out, or try to point out, this kind of misalignment around the perimeter. This is where these grids start to deregister. And the project is really just a kind of thesis that explores the structuring effect of a grid as an organizational system that can unify parts, and then the decoupling, unbinding of those parts to produce a kind of autonomy between them, right? And this idea of unbinding of the parts allows each of the parts to acquire a specific functionality without having to make the different parts commensurable with each other. And the pointed arch is one of the primary forms that we've used. And my interest in the arch is, first of all, as an object that has kind of migrated across different locations in the Mediterranean. I mean, each city is added to the expressive possibilities of its host culture. And of course, Ruskin's analysis of the Venetian arch is a really beautiful example, because in it we can read this entire history of the Mediterranean, its empires, trade routes, conflicts, etc. So this typological fragment not only forms part of our collective disciplinary material, but also a lens through which we can start to understand the city. Now, the thing is, today, the way we would read Ruskin is very different. Topologically, we would read each of these arches as differentiated expressions of a very similar mathematical structure. So technology has in some way shifted the burden of meaning from the particularity of the detail, which would have concerned Ruskin, to the general class of form from which each of these instances arises. So that means that we're probably not really interested in the particularities of these differences, but we're interested in the kind of topological geometry that can produce these different variations. Right, so returning to the project, this gives me an occasion to reflect on the plasticity of the arch and its formal possibilities. Okay, so let's skip through this. Okay, so you can see here that significant aspects of the program project into this sort of courtyard space. The way the project is organized is it tries to invert a classical circulation diagram. So rather than, for a cultural building, rather than walk in through the entrance, I'm going to try this. Rather than walk, can I get a mouse? No. That's quite annoying. Nope, okay, it's dead. Rather than walk in through the entrance into a sequence of successively more important rooms until you reach a central hall, there is a public street which bisects the building, splitting it in two. And then on your left side, there's a courtyard in which are arranged a series of basically rooms that have somehow decoupled, they've sort of come off the rest of the body of the building. And on the right-hand side, kind of another public space. So you have these two public spaces on either side of this street which bisects the middle. So in effect, the building then all takes place around the periphery. Right? And this is an example of the plinth. So circulation essentially starts from either one of these ramps and wraps around, always around the perimeter of the building. The idea here is that because there's kind of exhibition and display space, that there's always this link between the internal space and a view to the city on the outside. Let's go through this a little bit quickly.
There's another laser point.
Oh, great. It's massive. Oh wow, okay, I can point this at jumbo jacks and bring them down. Okay, so where are we? Okay, so looking at the ground floor plan, you can start to see some interesting things. First, that it gives very little clue as to the spatial quality of the building, which is almost entirely drawn from the section. And second, that we've taken this idea of autonomy between the parts quite far in trying to articulate a series of nested rooms that are loosely arranged. Now at the level one, but you can also see that the different problems posed to the exterior and interior parts of the building have shifted the grids, right? And so this registers on both the facade and the interior in misalignments, and you can kind of get a sense of these because this is a combined reflected ceiling plan. So you can see that this space in here and this space in here are treated separately to this colonnade which wraps around them, right? So this is kind of a very simple diagram for a building. You can start to see the way this produces this kind of complex spatial effect on the inside, where essentially the two different rows of columns just start to misalign with each other. This is a view showing this separation between the interior, this kind of cut, and this external colonnade which wraps around the entire building. I'm sorry, I'm describing this really vaguely because I'm just very aware of not really giving away too much about it. And if you actually have worked out where it is, and maybe some of you have entered the competition, that's great. I hope your project's better. This is a night view, and this is kind of basically a very simple concept diagram, right? In which we're understanding the interior and the exterior as responding to different kinds of problems and therefore acquiring a different sort of ordering system. The deregistration between those two different orders therefore reads in the facade of the building. It's kind of very simple. So if we return to the doctoral project or to the doctoral research, the way you could explain this would just be to say that the problem posed by the colonnade and the problem posed by these discrete elements within it are different problems, right? And this is why the ordering systems start to unbind from each other. Okay. This is also some photos of the model. And you can tell who we're riffing after. So. Okay, so that was the design work. I have some very short things to conclude with. We're just under an hour. Okay. Yeah. So working in a large institution at this moment in time is challenging. The precarious nature of work, funding cuts, research metrics, reduced contact hours, disaffected students, all these things present difficulties for academics. And unfortunately, it places us all in the position of having to be quite opportunistic about the sort of work that we do, and it places us in a very reactive position. Right? So an unfortunate consequence of this situation is that in the face of so many contradictory demands, it becomes very difficult as a practitioner, as an academic, to conceive of a kind of long-term, systematic, viable project. If you fail to do this, this only then exacerbates the precarious nature of your position within the institution in a kind of vicious circle that just keeps going on. So, as a way of thinking about my position and my work, I want to finish with a project that is definitely not related to the theme of trauma in any way, but I want to talk about it because it speaks to some of these issues, some of these kind of insecurities. It speaks to the importance of, I guess, developing a cultural environment around work that is able to sustain the forms of inquiry needed to address problems over a long period of time. And I say environment quite deliberately because this project is less about a systematic agenda for constructing and addressing a research question than it is about producing a kind of ambient background against which the effort takes place, right? And so the work I'm going to show you is a collaboration between Samantha Spur, David Burns, and most recently Nicole Bierman, who are friends and colleagues in Sydney. And we believe when we started this that any worthwhile project can only ever emerge from a creative environment that can sustain it. So we began to look into ways of literally manufacturing a supportive creative tissue in the city. And one of the turning points was reading this book, which besides being a beautiful account of a friendship between Patti Smith and Robert Mapplethorpe, is one of the best descriptions of a creative moment in the city, and this kind of crystallization of a scene, and in the way that scene then supported the actors who were involved with it. The second most important book, I think for me at least, was this book by Paolo Virno called A Grammar of the Multitude, which is really, I think, the best analysis of the precarious nature of contemporary work, or what is called post-Fordism, and the role of virtuosity, your virtuosity as a communicator, right? And that your value, your capital as a human being is located in your virtuosity as a communicator. And we were also inspired by Bernard Tschumi and his advertisements for architecture. So we sent out these advertisements to 30 architects and artists in Sydney, asking them to respond with a provocation, a script, respond to the provocation with a script for a performance that would take place in the city. And the mechanism that we set up was very formal. We developed an advertisement, it was sent to the artist, they responded with a script and a time and a place for the performance. We then invited photographers to record the performance with a camera obscura, and the critical thing about the camera obscura is that it captures a long duration on the inside of this chamber. The photographers, or the photographs are then sent back to us, along with scripts and additional text that we commission. We produce a series of 3 anonymous newspapers. The newspapers are distributed in bookshops and galleries internationally. It's kind of like this guerrilla campaign, huh? This is great. This is Nadia and Sarah. It's a meditation on the camera obscura's operation. It's quite beautiful. This is the website, so you can, all the information on it is on this website. Now, what's really interesting about this project is what started off as a very small project intended to stimulate this supportive creative culture in Sydney, maybe to create some channels for the maturation of new actors, has been much more successful than any of us envisaged. Not only is it fulfilling these ambitions, but since it was completed early this year, it has gained substantial overseas interest. So we were asked to curate a show on the work at the Prague Quadrennial in July. And at the moment, this is on exhibition at the Gwangju Biennale. You can see some photos here, curated by Sung Han Seng and by Ai Weiwei. Okay, so conclusion. Now the reason for showing you this work, which sits strangely alongside the other work I've talked about tonight, is that the support structure for research, right? Its ability to draw together a collective intellectual effort across different situations is, given the research questions I'm looking at, absolutely critical. Research structure is very rarely seen as an arena of creative possibility. But if it is true that interesting work is always organically related to the milieu from which it arises, then the environment, practices, and organization of that work must be conceived as an integral part of the project. And so what I've tried to show today is at once both a response to the complexity of these situations I'm describing, but also an adaptation to the conditions under which contemporary academic work takes place. And indeed, none of the research I've presented would have been possible without an incredibly long list of institutions and collaborators that have shared our interests and that have formed a supportive network for the work over the years. The URICA, the American University of Beirut, the AA, UAV in Venice, to name only the most recent, as well as people like Eyal Wiseman and Sam Jacoby, who taught the last workshops. And this international network of friends and collaborators is an indispensable part of the project, because finally, all these questions demand a collective intellectual effort. And I think that the idea of the question is important here, because in some ways it's the question that reorganizes the field. And if we reflect very quickly before I finish on urbanism, you'll know that urban discourse is somehow already filled with very typical problems, right? How to live in harmony with the environment, how to facilitate access, how to produce diversity, how to maximize open space, how to maintain formal compatibility, how to create incentives for densification, how to construct an adaptive framework for settlement. These are all chapters from a book. How to create a sense of place, how to produce a legible identity and innovative creative culture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These questions seem beyond doubt, and yet many of them are a matter of pure faith. The sense that these problems have a history in which contingency and power have played their part is obscured in the reflexive impulse of a solution. So the argument I'm trying to make is that a post-traumatic ethos understands the city as an arena in which contesting problems are articulated and in which conflict between these problems is central. These questions are incommensurable across different sites in the city, but also across different scales. And this fundamental inconsistency between questions surfaces through the idea of a limit or a separation of parts. And the question, in this sense, is understood as a locus of power that conditions the cases that forms its solution. It is the question that reorganizes the field because it works as an attractor, drawing both attention and labor into its domain. Sometimes these questions are posed on an empirical terrain, but just as often, they form part of an unthinking collective reflex. Gilles Deleuze, in his reading of Bergson, raises the issue as follows. It is the school teacher who poses the problems. The pupil's task is to discover the solutions. In this way, we are kept in a kind of slavery. True freedom lies in the power to decide, to constitute problems themselves. And this semi-divine power entails the disappearance of false problems as much as the creative upsurge of true ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Are there any questions? Yes,
I'm not sure exactly what the aim was of my question, but I just wanted to make a sort of observation and ask you about that, which is that I found it really quite refreshing and interesting in a funny way that your presentation your work was a lot based on sort of a duality that was implicit to the work. There was a sort of north-south gap, or there was a frame as opposed to an interior sort of, what did you call it, the unbinding parts. Or there was a center-periphery conversation. And in a sense, this goes quite strongly against a lot of work that has been proclaimed by a lot of people, where it's all about blurring the boundaries, where it's about sort of the endless array of slightly morphing or iterating sort of components that are all the same, but sort of turning into something else, but actually without the clear cut. I found interesting that in your exercise of these Mediterranean cities, you introduced the clear cut that didn't even existed. And somehow my question is to do with, is this something that is more autobiographical than anything else, or is this seen as really seen as a strategy, as an urban strategy, whereby cities are constructed by a series of, as you saw in Venice, sort of polynodal systems, where each of them, in fact, is constructed as a much more dual system. In other words, rather than saying the whole city has a sort of dual system, it's a combination of many smaller scale principles where probably this dual thinking applies. I don't know. I mean,
that's a beautiful observation. I think because there are so many things to say about such a comment. The first one would be to say that yes, it's not autobiographical, and I think this is the first time I've ever talked about this experience of going to Beirut when I was young. And it's only something that occurred to me just to, because I'm so reluctant. I mean, in a way, the most boring talk is when someone tells you about their life and then how what life influenced the work. I hate this kind of reduction of the work to details, so I was terrified of talking about it, but then I thought, right now, you know what, I'm just going to say it's okay. But then the first question is like, is it autobiographical? So no, it's not. And actually, it's a very specific response to contemporary architectural culture, which you pointed out, which is to say that somehow we have gone down this path of understanding the city, understanding the sites in which we're working in as kind of consistent fields all the time. And of course, this is really happening for a couple of reasons. To begin with, it's to do with sorts of tools that we're using as designers at the moment, which so technology is kind of enabling, I think, also this kind of view of the city as a kind of shifting matrix or contours or something like that. I think on the other hand, and there are of course some theoretical resources that this work is drawing on at the same time. And in a way, you could probably track it back to Deleuze, right, who has a kind of philosophical position on continuity. And then also the trajectory after Deleuze, people like Delanda, people like Stan Allen, of course, in the fields, reading and those sorts of things. And it's not to say that this work is positioned against that, because I think that always something like a field and something like a limit always have a relationship to each other. Actually, the camper, when it's first colonized, is a field condition, it's a marsh. It's like a classic sort of, ambiguous territory. But over a period of time, it acquires a definition, it acquires a shape. And I think the reason for my then, reorientation back towards an interest in the idea of limits and parts and autonomy across scales is really, for me, a way of almost correcting things maybe that have gone to a little bit too far in terms of continuity and understanding the city as a continuous surface. I mean, I could talk about this a lot. I think even like the Yokohama project, right? This is the Yokohama project. And you could say, every student I've taught is like Yokohama's child, right? In some way, they've all done this undulating surface project at some point, right? And I think while that's fine, and there's actually nothing wrong with undulating surfaces, at a certain point, the city, or those sorts of techniques don't scale up to the city very well, right? Which is why I started thinking about scaling. Because I think a lot of computational work, and a lot of work that depends on the sort of technologies, has issues scaling up because it essentially conceives of itself in a consistent way. The city presents you with problems that are actually inconsistent, right? So if you have these inconsistent, irreconcilable problems, then you need to rethink the idea of a limit. Right? So I think it's probably for those reasons that it's because I'm interested in technology, but I'm also interested in the city, and somehow, how do I theorize then the relationship between these two things?
Can I ask something else? How
Yeah.
interested are you in the notion of time and the impact that time has on, as an effect on those principles that you were outlining?
Yeah, absolutely interested in time. I think, and time can, well, so let's say, to take the example of approach to a project in which you take a very discrete object and you propose it for a part of the city. Now, you could say, well, okay, there's no sense in which this project is transforming over time. It's kind of static, it's not really doing anything. But then, I think if you understand that project as an exemplar, right, as somehow contributing to the collective cultural knowledge of the city, if you understand that project either as an exemplar or as a kind of type that can then be repeated in some other ways, then I think that the knowledge in that artifact can then have a kind of a series of repercussions on the city over time. So I think architecture always has this complex relationship to time. I don't think buildings, Mark Wigley once said architects are always really interested in the things they don't possess, right? Agility, swiftness, lightness, technological sophistication, and architecture is kind of inert in lots of ways. And so I think the question of time in architecture is always a question of understanding your position within a culture, right? And how the work that you inherit certain things from that culture, you have an interest in its history, you understand the way the discipline is conditioned, the way you need your space for action. But then you also realize your contribution back to that discipline in some way that perhaps you can contribute to the repertoire of forms that are available in the city and the situation. So I think, for me, the way I think about time in architecture is more on those terms, as a kind of historical time.
Maybe I would like to just add something, because I was intrigued by Marcus' first question and also your answer, because I'm not sure that it's a question of pure duality in a way, and I don't think you imply that, but in some ways, because you were talking about this kind of unstable infrastructures and in general this kind of unstable moment, so in a way that duality almost seems to be activated as computing that instability. There is a third element of noise or a kind of that is acting with this kind of binary condition. So in a way, it almost seems like you are activating these binary conditions in order to generate that instability. So I find that quite interesting. Obviously, I'm already thinking.
No, you're right, because the work on Beirut, which showed this work on Beirut, which shows the neighborhood unit kind of contracting as well, right? I think this would be precisely an example of kind of like a low-level noise in the system, which doesn't really have any sort of global coordination, producing quite clear spatial effects in the city over a period of time. So there's probably that dimension to it as well.
Because your design work is so active and thoughtful and kind of playful at the same time, I really wonder how the PhD is going to become concluded. You say it's something in December, and then I wonder if it's the transformation between Haussmann's Paris idea of I'm going to make a big cut, and Corbusier's Algiers idea, which is the big cut is the grand mechanism of an urban condition, and that this somehow circles the Mediterranean. I would just ask how does your PhD kind of form an end? Sorry.
Yeah.
Wait,
just wait. Well, I feel like doing that thing where you step down.
Yeah.
Disappear. No, look, it's a really complicated question. As you can see, like, this is. I drew this diagram for this lecture, and then when I finished it, I just had tears rolling down my face because I realized that probably it's been very productive for years, but maybe some things can start to focus or fall off in some way. I don't have an answer. It's too difficult.
I think I'm only asking because the design projects are so active.
Yeah.
They are so much about
okay.
the proposal and the fact that you have a kind of Venturi idea and a Haussmann idea and a Corbusier idea all kind of and even Niemeyer idea all coming forward and projecting themselves as active design dialogue, and then a PhD as a critical design tool.
Right.
You say it's an antithesis.
No, I can explain it now. Sorry, I thought you were asking something else. The only way I can conceive of it is by very carefully making sure that the work I do efficiently feeds into the various parts of things that I'm interested in. Right? So if the PhD work becomes entirely, and actually this is the point of this entire diagram is actually to say, I mean, I can't, if I have to be opportunistic and then separate out teaching work from sort of research interests I have, or from my PhD work, or from, as soon as these things start to fall apart, then of course we have this contradictory demand that's impossible. So I guess what I'm trying to present is that in order to have a cohesive research trajectory, right, which includes things like PhDs, it includes things like teaching, it includes things like practice as well, I need to conceive of them as one project, articulated through different sorts of practices, right? But essentially it's one project.
Should we take one more question? Thank you.
Thank you.